All right. Welcome, everyone. This is meeting number 16 of the Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee. This is our last meeting before you all get a well-earned, well-deserved break from our CAUTAC meetings. And just thank you so much for all of the great participation that we've had throughout these 16 meetings. Really appreciate it. We're going to jump right in. Today, we're going to continue our conversation, our discussions about how urban growth boundary exchanges, urban growth boundary management agreements, and annexations or annexation agreements can help support housing goals and accommodate needed housing. I'll note that unfortunately, Karin can't be with us today. She's not feeling well, and Maddie, I believe, is on the road. So they send their regrets, but be assured that they'll be back with us. Well, working on things throughout the next few months, and then back with us when we meet again in, I guess, April. So yes, you urban growth boundary exchanges, urban growth boundary management agreements, annexations. Specifically today, for our conversation, we'd like everyone to be thinking about possible rules and guidance that could help on these topics. With the understanding that rules typically provide clarity and specificity, whereas guidance usually provides best practices. And then taking that one step further, again, this is something to keep in the back of your mind, but at the end of the meeting, we might reflect on some of these topics we're talking about today, because they are big topics. Urban growth boundary, or urban growth management agreements and annexation agreements, and think about whether or not these topics are substantial enough to require their own rulemaking, kind of separate from what we're doing through this rulemaking. So that's just another thing that came up in our conversations, and we wanted to mention. So before we dive into conversation, Jenna is going to introduce our focus area for today and questions for today from the Racial Equity Framework.
Yes, thanks, Steve. One moment. Okay. Today's racial equity framework focus area is measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. And today's focus is really around how DLCD can provide meaningful support to cities and counties to help ensure that urbanization efforts are successful and effective in accommodating an identified housing need, with special attention to today's topics that Steve just mentioned on UGB exchanges and annexation agreements. So the key questions for consideration under this focus area are: how can we measure racial equity impact and effectiveness of this rulemaking? How can DLCD assist local governments in tracking, measuring, and reporting outcomes? And also, what additional resources are needed to accomplish this? So with these questions in mind, we're really trying to ensure that rules and guidance that we develop are effective and actually result in the outcomes we want at a local implementation level. So how do we get there and actually achieve our goals and make sure that our efforts result in the type of housing that is needed as identified in a contextualized housing need? And how can this rulemaking help local governments when it comes to UGB exchanges and annexation specifically? So just some things to keep in mind as we continue our discussion. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Jenna. And that makes me think again about how, another aspect of equity is thinking about how, potential rules and guidance, would work for larger jurisdictions versus smaller ones, because we want to be thinking about what our smaller jurisdictions have the capacity to do. So thank you for those. Okay, We're going to start by continuing a conversation from last time about urban growth boundary exchanges. And the question being, uh, what process should be used to determine the appropriate designation of outgoing lands in a UGB exchange? We heard from several people last time. I think Martha weighed in and Heather weighed in, I think. And we just want to kind of continue where we continue where we left off. Some of the possibilities that we talked about were, reverting back to resource land, farm forest land, reverting back to previous county zoning, if that's something that we know, um, changing the designation to match adjacent zoning, if there's a predominant zone, or maybe that's multiple zones. And another option that was raised was considering placing those lands into urban reserves. So that's just some of the things that we talked about last time, and I want to open it up to hear, maybe people have specific instances that can help them think about what would have made sense or what would make sense. But yeah, what occurs to all of you? And we'll start with Mary Kyle.
Thanks. The break between the last meeting and this gave me the opportunity to talk to some of my colleagues about this. And so it seems to us that what makes sense is to zone the land for what it's inherently appropriate for that piece of land, as if it had never been in the UGB. Is that BFU? Is it forest? Is it an exception area? Is it some natural resource? Because it's been taken out for any of a number of reasons that a city found it didn't make sense for it to be in its urban growth boundary. And therefore, and that might have been brought in 40 years ago and may never make sense to come in. And it seems to us, well, what would it have been zoned if it planned and zoned if it wasn't in the urban growth boundary? Is there scattered development? Is it an exception area? Is it farm and forest land? If it's something that should be in an urban reserve, then go through an urban reserve process and see. But maybe it doesn't even make sense to be in an urban reserve. And of course, if it is an urban reserve, then it has to be in the first consideration. And maybe a city wouldn't want that. That wouldn't make sense. So it seems to us it's kind of being treated as though it was never in, sort of it was a mistake in some ways to bring it in the first place. So take it out and see what you would do with it then.
Great, thanks. That's a good starting point. Al, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think I agree with what Mary Kyle has said, with perhaps one adjustment. That is that you don't want that process that of deciding what it's going to be, what the land taken out is going to be, to hold up the process of bringing the other land in. And so you need to sequence things in such a way that the other land can come in, and the designation, the appropriate designation of the property that's going out is a separate process that's not somehow linked to completing the process on the incoming property.
Thanks, Alan. And one of my follow-up questions to both of yours, not for you necessarily, we'll go on to Damien, but is, what does that process look like? If we are going to have a process to designate these lands, and I think what you said, Mary Kyle, makes sense. People might disagree on what that logical designation might be. So we should think also.
Just like they did when counties did the original zoning of lands, right?
Sure.
Farm, forest, exception areas. But I agree with Al that it's a different process than how you're going to zone land coming in. But and if it should be an urban reserve, great, designated as that. But again,
I think this does get, thanks. I think this does get into one of our other kind of sub questions, which is, who decides? Is it county or city? And what are the roles and responsibilities of counties and cities, which is something we've been talking about last time as well.
Well, it's outside the UGB. That seems pretty clear to me that that's a county.
But... Okay. Damien.
but I'm,
Oh, thank you. I had a question about the option that we're talking about, which is designating an urban reserve if we're taking property out of a UGB and designating an urban reserve. I'd like to hear a little bit more from the team at DLCD if that's been done before, if that's more of a like an urban reserve light process, or if it really is something where a city and county would have to do this work jointly and then develop the factual base to say, you know what, it's not something that we see being developed in the next 20 years for needed housing or economic opportunities, but we should maybe put it in the reserve and do some additional planning for, say, infrastructure.
Thanks, Damien. Before we go to Brock, Beth, could you maybe, I know that you've had some experience with this. I don't know if it answers Damien's question.
It answers Damien's question in one area. I'm gonna share my screen briefly because the visuals are helpful. We did this in Madras. This is the whole city, obviously. This whole big area over here is a big urban reserve, and we were taking out their bootleg. We'll just call it a bootleg. And we were bringing in, we'll just call it, this was 40 acres. We were bringing in 40 acres. It was within an acre or two. The area that we were bringing in was zoned, I think, rangeland and part of the urban reserve. And so we took out this 40 acres. I believe it became zoned rangeland because it's surrounded by rangeland. And we essentially said we're swapping an equivalent amount of land from inside the urban reserve to inside the UGB, and then outside the UGB to inside the urban reserve. Because, you know, otherwise it would have been this sort of void in the middle of urban reserve. And it was, you know, very similar in nature, the two different pieces of land. So in that case, it was a pretty clear answer, in part because they already had urban reserves, Damien.
And Beth, did you do a full urban reserve process for that land?
No, we basically we made some findings around it. But otherwise, no.
Okay, that's helpful to know. That's something I was thinking about too. Brock.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going to echo the comments of everyone so far. I agree that, like, there's a certain extent where we need to just kind of like look at it like it hasn't really had anything going on before, right? At the same time, definitely want to put a big emphasis on Al's point of not letting it hold up the process of bringing in the new land that you need, and the way that timeline lines up. And then also, I'd really like Damien's comment about like putting it in an urban reserve for maybe 1 or 2 planning cycles, right? 40 years. And then after that, if you want to take it out of the urban reserve, that's something that could be done, right? Because if it sits in that urban reserve for 40 years and other lands have been coming in, then it's probably not going to be, next up on the target list for the city to expand into. Maybe 20 years isn't quite long enough, which is why I would suggest 2 cycles, but open to feedback on that.
Go ahead, Mary Kyle.
yeah, I have some thoughts on what Brock just said, and I thought that was a really good example that Beth just had, because that's one where it just like look at the piece of land and stand on its own. It makes complete sense that it would be in the urban reserve, but there may be pieces of land that a city would not want in an urban reserve because they might not want it on the list to be brought in at all because it just doesn't make sense. And so that's why I think looking at it in the context of where that piece of land is relative to what would you zone it in the first place. And there, I mean, they actually zoned it rangeland and kept it in the urban reserve, but that might not make sense in some other places. So I wouldn't want to assume that any piece of land should be that, as opposed to looking at it in that context.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
It's very important. Yeah.
Go ahead, Beth.
So I think that what Roseburg recently did was take some land, swap some land out that was sort of, on the other side of a ridge line or something like that. And I suspect, I don't know, but Mary Kyle is exactly right that land would not be where in the future they would want to bring land in, because it was very difficult, if not impossible, to serve that land. Whereas, the Madras example was, it would just be easier to serve the land that we swapped in, and it would fit into a growing planned unit development, where they're actually getting more housing and more housing that was relatively affordable. So, yeah.
Brock, you have more on this?
I was just gonna say, it kind of seems like one of those questions where like the most reasonable answer is just to provide the local governments with some flexibility on how to take it out and just say like, these are the options on the table, right? And given the context of this piece of land and the rest of your, city limits and your UGB and your urban reserves, right? Make an informed decision. But I think if we get too prescriptive about it, then we're going to be splitting hairs where maybe the hair is too thin to split, for a terrible metaphor, but
Yeah, I do think, there, Mary Kyle mentioned, it seems outside the UGB or outside, the UGB is the county's territory. But we know if there's urban reserves that both parties kind of need to be involved in some of these conversations. So we need to be thinking about the roles and responsibilities of each there as well. Another sub question we had is if the the whether or not the land is significantly constrained or buildable should change our thinking about how those designations are placed on these lands. And I'm hearing from everyone that kind of take a look at what you got and make the best decision based on what you have and the characteristics of the land. But that was one of the questions we had, if a heavily constrained land should be treated differently than land without constraints or with fewer constraints. Go ahead, Brock.
yeah, and I think that kind of tags back to some of the questions that we were asking about earlier of like, what does it mean for land to be constrained for a city, right? If you're in Newport, right, that's going to look very different than if you're in Bend, than if you're in Harney County, right? And so I think having the flexibility of just like, here's your options, make a smart choice, kind of seems like the right way to go for that as well.
That seems reasonable. I wonder if any of our communities that have those more heavily constrained lands have any kind of concur with that or have any different perspectives based on their experience with wetlands or slopes or floodplains, all the other hindrances. Go ahead, Damian.
Thanks. Just for context, I think when we were looking at constrained lands or as part of our expansion back in 2016, I mean, slopes were not a big deal. When I say not a big deal, we didn't have a lot of lands that had slopes that were in excess of 25%. But I can see that being an issue if someone's looking at taking, or a city's taking land out of a UGB and looking at what's going to be more developable more quickly if we're focusing on housing production. Floodplains could be an issue. I think while it's not a constraint yet, I mean, one of the things that we're starting to think about, and I mean, starting very much in the literal sense, starting to think about is like just, wildfire risk, given what the Department of Forestry has been doing with their work. It's not a constraint, but it is something we're thinking about is to look at when looking at whether that could be mitigated as part of our development for, say, needed housing or for jobs. So just some random thoughts about how I think those are all reasonable things to look at in terms of whether the land is constrained or not.
Kevin.
I just want to clarify the question. I think we're talking about lands that are constrained that are coming out of a UGB. Is that right? So in that context, yeah, I'm thinking it's a little different than, typically, or I guess on my side of on the inside of the UGB, I think of constrained lands as well. It's hard to build housing or it's hard to locate employment uses on these lands. When you're taking it out of a UGB, we don't always think about development potential in the same way. I mean, forest lands have all kinds of slopes and, I don't know, there are a lot of different uses that happen outside UGBs. I'm not sure, I don't know to what extent the constraints should inform the county zoning that's applied. I guess that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Kevin. Derek?
Yeah, I would reiterate what Kevin just said, particularly in our context. We're large. Our community is largely surrounded by forest land, and if we're pulling, acreage out of our urban growth boundary, it's likely to go under a commercial forest designation. And as long as that land is suitable for that purpose, I think that's really more the bar there. Once it's out of our urban growth boundary, is that land suitable for commercial forest purposes? I think that makes more sense.
Thank you, Derek. Ted?
Yeah, just noting the sort of nuance here that if land is taken out of an urban growth boundary as part of an exchange, it by definition has buildable acres because that's what you're exchanging. But I don't know that that matters. What we're really talking about is needing some flexibility for how those lands are planned for after being removed.
Thanks, Ted. And we did talk about, I think you're exactly right about the way the rules are today, but we also did talk about, should there be, an opportunity to exchange more buildable land for less, that you would zone at a higher density or things. So we should kind of have all those things in mind, but you're right on there. Al?
A couple of things going back to your distinction between guidance and rulemaking and statutes. From an interpretive standpoint, it might be helpful to simply clarify the commission's understanding of the way the statutes work. And so currently, when land is outside an urban growth boundary and is zoned for forest use, it is subject to the Forest Practices Act, which means it's not subject to a number of the kinds of constraints under Goal 5 that it would have inside the city. We had a case involving the wildlife safari, for example, where the urban growth boundary was actually expanded not to provide housing, but to protect the viewshed around wildlife safari. And if that went out of the UGB, then that land would be subject to being clear cut. So that's one consequence. And so just to clarify that would be a consequence if that's what we're willing to see happens if the zoning is reattached. That's one possibility. The other statute that comes to mind is the one that says that when you annex property, if the city does not rezone the property at the time of annexation, it simply retains the zoning that it had when it came in to the city. And I suppose that something like that could work for urban growth boundaries as well. So you just want to clarify, I think some clarification as to the application of those statutes might be helpful. I'm not sure where that takes us, but I think they have potential. And they really amount to, one more reason why we don't want the question of the fate of these lands that are coming out to somehow become an obstacle to being able to put the land that comes in to the use we brought it in for. Thanks.
Thanks, Al. And that does, thanks for bringing us back to kind of the guiding context of rules versus guidance. And I feel like so far what I'm hearing is more guidance about, some sort of guidance about look at adjacent uses, look at what's on the land and what makes sense and determine the best designation. But I wonder if there also couldn't be some simple safe harbors or something, or that really helps, like Derek said, there's kind of no question for Newport what those lands would be, and maybe that's something that could be put into rules or safe harbors to just make it that much more straightforward. Go ahead, Martha.
Well, thank you for saying that. That was kind of what I was thinking as a person who would be doing the rezoning potentially for the county. I think it's important to keep in mind that if rezoning a property involves rezoning a property, it becomes an appealable decision unless it's somehow structured differently in the rules. And I would hope, or I would encourage you to look at safe harbors. You know, it seems obvious if the land had never been rezoned to begin with, the answer is easy, right? You don't have to do anything. It just stays zoned, whatever it was under the county, which is what happened when Metro did the swap in Clackamas County. We didn't have to do anything because the land was still under county zoning. But if you're talking about pulling something out and actually reapplying a different zone, the county would have to go through a comp plan zone change process. And so to the extent that there's options to do what seems right for the property, that's excellent and helpful. But there also needs to be some sidebars and some safe harbors, because the last thing we want to do is tie up a process in appeals because the property owner is not happy with the new zoning that they're going to get. I mean, obviously we can't totally avoid that. I get that, but
No, but that's
Just some-
helpful. That's really
something to
helpful.
keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Ted.
Yeah, Martha's comments reminded me of concerns about takings claims, and I'm losing track of the numbers in Measure 47 claims that you may get as a consequence of effectively downzoning. And I wonder if there's any way to provide some protection from that. I don't know how, but
Thanks, Ted.
Honest offer that I'm not an attorney. I've heard some folks opine with some legal background opine that placement of land out of a UGB is not necessarily the same property right as you would have with a zone change. Now, I'm not saying that's definitive, but it is on a different scale from an up zone or a down zone where you're having a clearer impact on property values, I guess.
Thanks, Kevin. Go ahead, Martha.
Yeah, I think Kevin's right, also not an attorney, but I think Kevin's right. But I think the concern is if it's being brought out of an urban growth boundary and also downzoned, then there might be a concern about takings.
See your point. Thank you.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, and whether or not I agree with Kevin and Martha, I think that's a kind of issue where we wouldn't want to rely on rulemaking to resolve it. The special statute that Oregon has about the effect of rezonings on property values, we have sort of a hair trigger taking statute that's worse than probably any place else in the country. And the definition of zoning is one that I wouldn't want to guess at what a court would say. I go back to legislature on that.
Great. Jenna or Beth, do you have any other observations or questions that you want to ask the group? No?
This seems to be one of the more straightforward things that we've discussed.
Yeah. All right. Well, then let's move on to our next topic, which we list as annexation agreements. Although I also want to include urban growth management agreements as part of this, because I feel like they sometimes have similar elements to them. But hopefully people got a chance to read the memo on annexations that Maddie prepared and was included in your packet, I believe. And the question that was asked was, what elements of an annexation agreement can facilitate the production of needed housing? And I would extend that to urban growth management agreements. What are, when we're looking at, annexation agreements are more focused on the jurisdiction and the property owner, and our UGMAs are more focused on city and county. I think with the UGMAs, we talked about kind of what agreements between cities and counties can help prevent levels of urbanization in those UGB areas that is going to hinder future development at higher densities to get the types of housing we want. And then how can annexation agreements be used as a tool to get meet housing goals and accommodate needed housing at needed densities as urban growth expansion areas are annexed. So we'll start with Brock.
I have a question. So I was looking at the statutes in ORS 222. Has there ever been a case where you have, consenting property owners, right, and the city's on board, and it gets sent to a citywide ballot and the annexation's rejected? Because I know the possibility exists in statute, but I don't know whether it's actually occurred or not. I know there's certain conditions for whether it goes to the ballot or not, but
Kevin, do you want to weigh in on that? I mean, I think our laws have changed over time here about how that works, but maybe you could talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, just a clarification. Yeah, it's no longer legal for cities to require a voter annexation for annexation decisions. There was a bill that passed. I can't remember the number of it. It's been, I don't know, 8-10 years.
2017, I think.
Yeah, I know there are some rules about electors within the area and outside the area. That's a little bit different than a voter annexation process where the general populace, decides on an annexation question.
okay. Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of, Kevin, is that portion that you were talking about. Yeah, I almost wonder if I wonder if now, we think it's reasonable to just say, like, this is something that the legislature might want to look at and see, just as far as like what maybe changes would be needed here that we can't make in rule that would need statutory change for this, because it seems like this is going to be a really important part of the process, and just making sure that we're not, I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. But
I'm not really clear on what are you proposing, Brock?
well, like here, give me a sec. I'll go back and find the statutes and
Okay. Mary Kyle?
Yeah, I think my thing's on the same thing Brock is talking about. So let's just see. I would find it helpful to add to this memo something that describes what I think are 3 different ways that land can be annexed to a city. Maybe there's a 4th by now, but there's like island annexations, a couple different ways of owner consent with double majorities of owner, number of acres, property owners, et cetera, like that. So one, an understanding of the ways that exist now for land to be annexed into cities. And then secondly, how our property tax limitations play into whether and when land is developed, and what the tensions that timing or phasing puts or means for cities and counties. Or because I just feel like I'm in rooms where those kinds of things are brought up and I don't understand it, but it seems it's not land use. It's these other things that are impacting sensible urbanization of land over time because they're in the annexation or the property taxing system. So for me, before I can talk about this other stuff, it'd be helpful to know what these other dynamics are. And I definitely agree with Brock that it seems like there needs to be a change in annexation laws to make it more easier for cities to urbanize land over time. It has been brought into a UGB and then to bring it into annexation. But anyway.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. I think the memo kind of touches on some of those same components in the key points on the second page, but we will.
That laying out of all the 3, maybe there's 4 different ways to actually annex land, and why is it, if we're bringing land into an urban growth boundary to meet housing needs, I mean, of course, there's other needs that could be brought in, industrial, all these other things to meet certain urban needs, and yet an owner consent can get in the way of doing that. That's really a wrench thrown into to this process, potentially, at least in some areas where an owner might not want to. But anyway,
great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Al?
Yeah, I would say that, that what we're really looking at is, one more situation where we're trying to, cut down on the veto points and at least figure out where they are, and put them all in one place, which hopefully would not be the annexation stage in a decision. I've had several experiences in litigation over annexations, and my sense is that there's still quite a lot of opportunity out there for annexations to be blocked by voter. The voter path is still a path. It has not been eliminated. Other paths have been created. Those paths have been contested and narrowed by some of the court decisions that have come down, so that that's still out there. We're dealing with situations right now where we can have basically, as Mary Kyle's pointed out, guided, complete discretion on the part of a property owner as to whether to come in, complete discretion on the part of a neighbor as to whether to appeal a category of those, complete discretion on the part of the city as to what it wants to, be able to refer to the voters or not. And the result is that there are opportunities kind of all over the place. You never know which one's going to pop up where. And then there's also real problems in the way that the relationship is structured. I had the case which I lost, which was the heritage case in Corvallis, where the city actually approved an annexation, and my client, and then referred it because that's what the charter said to do. My client did not appeal the decision to refer it because the general rule on annexations is you can't appeal a initiative or referendum vote until you know which way it has gone. Well, we got the Court of Appeals and they said, no, you should have appealed this when you won. And so that just makes it crazy. And I think those are the kinds of things that can be affected by the legislature. The legislature has its own constraints. The city of Corvallis and there's a very active pro or anti-annexation group, I think, based in Philomath, which is very good in the legislature, but also has been pretty successful in the courts at preventing DLCD from putting through some of its own initiatives to solve some of these problems in the past. So there are even issues out there as to whether or not and to what extent the legislature can clear up the last of these problems, so that it may be that the thing that we really have to do is make it so that annexation is just not something that that has a land use handle on it, that it's essentially neutral as to its land use consequences. That's kind of what the Cape decision is about. To the extent to which we can make that happen and have those land use issues still there for people to argue about at other stages, I think we're making the annexation process itself less of a barrier and more transparent. And that would probably require something in the way of additional legislation. That's been kind of the direction I think the legislature's been heading for the past few years, but there's still a few more fences to come down.
Thank you, Al. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I wanted to first ask a clarifying question about our discussion today on annexation agreements. Are you interested in hearing examples of what topics have been addressed in annexation agreements that will help support housing production? Because if the answer is yes, I can summarize an example of one of our annexation agreements where I think we've got some of those elements included.
I think that's certainly part of it, Damien. So I would say, I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone from DLCD, but I would say, yes, that's part of what we're trying to figure out is how they can help get us needed housing.
So in 2016, briefly, there were a number of areas that were included in the UGB expansion because either the property owner or owners had agreed to provide a certain amount of deed restricted affordable housing. That commitment was memorialized in comprehensive plan policies and then relied on to draft annexation agreements which then outlined phasing in terms of after this many units, so many units of affordable had to be developed and so forth. So that's an element we've included in our annexation agreements where affordable housing was an element. In these and in others, we've also used the annexation agreement to look at phasing of infrastructure. So we know when things are going to get extended, not just for developing the property, but to and through so that adjacent areas that might be included in a UGB expansion area could also be developed. And let's see here. So just looking at an example here. I think those are the two kind of big ones in terms of just, affordable housing, infrastructure, but I think also what's encapsulated with our work we've done in annexations is also requiring concurrent master plans for our annexation, for our UGB expansion area, so that the developers then required to show how they're going to satisfy plan policies that were adopted for that expansion area in terms of numbers of units by type, so that we could also make sure that we're getting an adequate mix of not just single family detached, but attached multifamily and middle housing, including attached single family as part of the overall master plan. So that's an example of what's worked for us.
Thanks, Damien. That's really helpful. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the statutes that I was looking at like range between anywhere between 222, 120 through like 150, and there's different ways, as Mary Kyle was mentioning, that you can kind of bring that land in. 150 is kind of the like end result there, but the city legislative body shall determine if the results of the election from the official figures returned by the county clerk, right? If the city legislative body finds that the majority of all votes cast in the territory favors annexation, then the legislative body can, put in an ordinance and say that it's annexed, right? But there are certain circumstances where like it could go to all voters of the city, and someone over in the northeast corner of Wilsonville, right, versus land that's potentially coming in the southwest corner, whatever. It seems strange to me that people on the other side of the city would have a say in whether or not land that's 10 miles away from them is able to be brought in.
So you're kind of echoing what Al was talking about in terms of closing some of those opportunities to block annexations.
Yeah.
Thanks. Martha.
I think I forgot half what I was going to say, but I know enough about annexation just to be a little bit dangerous. And I guess I was under the impression, like Kevin had said, that that voter approved annexation was no longer allowed. And I know that it was blocking annexations. I live in Oregon City, and it was very well known in Oregon City that you couldn't annex property because the voters kept saying no. And so I feel like that hurdle has been taken care of, but maybe there's some nuances there that I don't know, right? And so that's certainly worth looking into, because I know just from experience living here that getting rid of that voter annexation has generated a lot more annexations and a lot more development.
Yeah.
So that definitely is a hurdle if it still exists anywhere. I think that my understanding of annexation is that there's very few ways a city can force annexation. It's like the island annexation, and maybe there's a couple of other very limited circumstances. And I guess I would hesitate to create more ways that cities could force annexation. I don't know. I don't think that that's the route that we should go. It's my opinion. I feel like that maybe there's a way to create more incentives, or something like that, which again is not rules. Maybe that's under the whole guidance area, because even if you force someone to annex, you can't force them to develop. And so I don't know that that's necessarily a way to get more properties developed, and it creates angst, for lack of a better word. I think that's most of what I was going to say.
Thank you, Martha. Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as we embark on a conversation about annexation and in looking at this memo, I think it would be helpful to actually build into this some discussion about withdrawals, because the two go hand in hand, annexation and withdrawals, and particularly in the context of special districts. For us, for example, we expand to the south. And a lot of our growth goes into an area that had been served by the Seal Rock Water District. And so we had to spend some time and negotiate an urban service area agreement with that district to kind of redefine the boundary, the north of where we would be assuming service as we grow and annex. And it's important to keep in mind that when a city, for example, takes over service responsibilities from a special district like Seal Rock, we then have an obligation to address the cost of the remaining useful life of the infrastructure that they had in place. And also, we have to deal with outstanding bond debt because you're taking a significant number of properties in many cases out of their district. And so that, those properties would no longer be property owners would no longer be there to pay down that debt. And so that has to be addressed as part of the urban service area agreement. Now, I realize that in some cases, that district will provide the urban service, and that's not an issue maybe in those cases. But in others like ours, Seal Rock is not set up to provide urban levels of service, water service. And so we had to hammer that out. And I imagine we're not unique in that regard.
Thanks, Derek. That's a helpful perspective. And I know that the memo also discussed, the role that those special service districts play in these processes. Corey.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I share a lot of the sentiments that have been shared on this call of needing to simplify the process. I think what I wanted to circle back to was just the example that Damien shared about using those annexation agreements to understand the phasing of infrastructure and have like more clarity on what like the infrastructure picture looks like. Because I think like what we see is that until you're on the other side of the annexation fence, right? Like the likelihood of developing and getting that done, it still remains a few steps out. And so as we're trying to urbanize, as we're trying to deliver more housing, I do think looking at that particular element, because I think in a lot of our conversations over the 16 meetings we've had has been, the better plan, the better finance, the more clear that infrastructure piece is and that development readiness is, the better off we're going to be in delivering the housing we need more quickly. And so I think looking to those agreements for those kinds of things, and to the point, I think it was Marcia who brought it up, once you're annexed in, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to develop. And so finding ways in those agreements to create a little more, clarity or distinct likelihood, right? That like that development is going to proceed as planned, I think would be a good thing to look at. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Go ahead, Al.
Just a couple of things on Corey's point. The recently had a urban area management agreement process between Coos County and the city of Bandon involving some potentially, basically it was affordable housing kind of an area. And with both the city and the county willing and wanting to amend their agreement, it took them about 4 years. Part of it was funding, part of it was staff changes. It's not an easy thing to do, but it would seem to me that if there's anything that could be done to facilitate that process and perhaps create some language that small jurisdictions could just plug into their management agreements that would cover the before and after of annexation, including the issue of what happens with special district responsibilities. The more that can be dealt with, I think that in terms of more guidance, in terms of technical assistance, that would be very helpful. Then I want to circle back to Kevin's comment earlier on and say that I think Kevin's more right than I was about the width of the path for voter annexations. I'm an old guy, so and he's still in the saddle. I was just taking a look at a 2020 memo on the Oregon Communities for a Voice in Annexations, which goes through all of the changes over the years. And this is from a group which is very unhappy with the way in which things have gone. And so they outlined 5 different kinds of annexations, many of which involve voter approval. And they point out that citizens in more than 30 cities around the state implemented charter amendments to require city voter approval. And it talked about how that went. And then it pointed out that there was a legislation adopted in 2016, Senate Bill 1573, that effectively eliminated both citizens and their city governments from having a say in most, if not all, annexations. As we read the law now, and this was the opponents, the city must annex territory if a developer wants it and the territory conforms to the local comp plan requirements. So Martha may be right that it is much, much less of a problem than it was back when I was wrestling with these issues.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. I think Kevin dropped that legislation into the chat as well.
Good.
Heather, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 cents in about the conversation. I felt like the discussion so far had more been about removing barriers for folks that do want to annex and not about finding ways to force annexation. So just kind of supporting what Martha was saying earlier. And to that point, Eugene is actually exploring right now how to incentivize voluntary annexation. That's definitely the direction that Eugene would be going, is more in the voluntary, how to incentivize it rather than force it. And so I think whatever we do here, that's going to be important to keep in mind. So just kind of supporting that piece of it.
Thank you, Heather. Sarah, go ahead, and then we'll go to Damien. Sorry if I skipped you, Damien.
Yeah, just wanted to kind of jump on the infrastructure comments, and that I think some of the most common annexation agreements that we've seen have been around, and maybe developer agreements as well, around the provision of infrastructure, who's responsible for what, maybe cost sharing with local government. And then, I think as far as incentives, I may have mentioned it before, but there are some options for property tax kind of ramp ups or deferrals for, I want to say it's 20 years now. I think it used to be 10. And that can definitely be an incentive, particularly for, an area that's, coming from an unincorporated county with lower tax rates, coming into a city that can help offset those costs.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Go ahead, Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I hit lower hand by accident. I was thinking about Derek's comments about special districts, and it got me thinking about, I don't know how prevalent this is around the state, but situations where a city is dealing with a private utility that provides something like water service. And I don't know if this is more appropriate for rules, maybe more appropriate for guidance on how to coordinate with them, especially if you're in a situation where you might be removing an area that is not in their district or in their district, their service area, for lack of a better word, and then how do you coordinate that? I think in our experience, we have one water private utility that we work with regularly that will serve anybody, but I don't know if that's the case with other cities around Oregon.
Thanks, Damien. I wonder, the fourth kind of point in the memo that was provided talks about how UGMAs might lead to smoother, more well-executed annexations. And Heather, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but you shared some of Eugene's experiences with UGMAs and the responsibilities of the city versus the county. And I think there were also pieces in there about how service districts need to be involved in those conversations. And I was wondering if you could share some of that, and if you've seen an impact on how those UGMAs then lead to annexation, and if it helps lead to a more efficient annexation process, if that is something that you've observed.
Yeah, we did some. You completed some UGMAs, I think I heard somebody call them last time. UGMAs, and we did that with urban reserves. And we haven't expanded the urban growth boundary. We expanded the urban growth boundary and then we did urban reserves, and we're in the process right now of doing our 20-year UGB analysis. So we haven't had the opportunity to invoke those UGMAs that we established with the urban reserves. But essentially if I were to break them down, they are essentially like recognizing, as was said earlier, that these special districts are going to shrink once we expand the urban growth boundary. And so potentially, not all of them, but some of them will. And so they're really about an agreement to coordinate when that time happens. Sorry, hopefully you can't hear my dog. And so we really haven't had the opportunity to trigger those. For land inside the urban growth boundary already, we have agreements with the county that we will administer. I think we talked about this last time, administer the land use code and administer the planning for those UT urban transitional areas. So I do think that is smoother. And that also necessitates the county adopting those regulations inside the UT area. And so there's just like a general understanding of what's going on between both the city and the county. So yeah, so to your question about whether or not that smooths annexation specifically, I think it does to some degree because they have the same metro plan designation and it's the same entity talking to them about the development potential of the property. And they have, in our case, they have the same zoning typically, or oftentimes they have the same zoning, not always, but that would come when they come into the city limits. Sometimes it's in an ag holding zone, but yeah, so I don't know if that's directly relevant, but those are kind of our examples.
Well, that is helpful. Thank you, Heather. Let's go to Kevin.
Steve, I want to make a few kind of basic points that may be obvious to everyone here, but in my experience working with cities throughout the state, I've been really surprised to see that there are still cities out there that will allow extension of water and sewer service into the UGB without requiring annexation. If we're talking about incentivizing the annexation process, to me, that is fundamental. And I understand that political pressure can be exerted to allow for that, but I really think the rules allow it. So it's possible to extend those urban services, again, outside city limits, but within an urban growth boundary. But once you do that, what's the incentive of the property owner? So if I were to have a Christmas wish list of, something that we could change, that would be on it. The other incentive, I think one of the questions we've talked about is what's the incentive for annexation is, more intensive zoning, smaller land divisions. And so that's where an urban growth management agreement or UGMA can really help to clarify, like, here's what happens under county jurisdiction. Here's what happens under city jurisdiction. There are extenuating circumstances. I know health hazard annexations are a thing that have happened in a number of places. So notwithstanding that, I guess I would advocate for maybe guidance at a minimum on, best practices for managing that urbanization process. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I appreciate it, Kevin. That's really helpful. Wondering if Beth or Jenna have any observations or questions for the group based on the discussion we've been hearing. Beth, go ahead.
No, annexation is well beyond what I know a whole lot about, so I'm holding back on this one.
I know you know your way around an UGMA though, I'm sure. So
well, a little bit. So
I don't have much to add, Steve. I think what I'm doing is really just absorbing the conversation and really you know, part of our job here is figuring out what belongs in guidance, what belongs in rule, what could maybe be deferred. I'm hearing some advocacy for legislative changes, but you know, what can we do now within our control? You know, how to incentivize annexation. I heard some ideas around that, and how to facilitate that process. So I'm listening, absorbing, but I don't think I have anything further to add at this point.
Well, from what I've heard of this conversation so far today, I'm not feeling like these matters are substantial. I think there are things we can do within this rulemaking process, and I'm not feeling like these issues are things that need to be put off for their own rulemaking. I think it's more a question of, as we talked about with outgoing UGB lands, you know, providing some guidance and maybe some safe harbors to make it more straightforward and as to what those designations should be. And and then I think we have some good models around annexations, from whether it's UGMAs that lay out the urbanization process, or things like Damien shared, where they are requiring certain you know, types of affordable housing, or laying out how infrastructure is going to be you know, provided. I've heard, you know, I think we have models of good practices here, and it's a question of do we keep that in guidance, or are there certain, you know, rules or safe harbors that we would advocate for? So I'd open that question up to the group if they have any inclinations either way there, or any other comments to share. But we also can, yeah, I'm not opposed to adjourning early here today, if we feel like we've talked these issues through. So any last thoughts or comments on these topics?
I actually just thought of something,
Okay.
but I am not opposed to ending early either. You know, something that was mentioned in the memo, as well as that point of annexation where a zoning designation is assigned. Sometimes the lowest density option is chosen. And what impact does that have for a city who is trying to accommodate 20 years of housing need? Will that lead to more kind of a higher frequency of UGB amendments over time? Kind of any thoughts on you know, that translation of a comp plan designation to a zoning designation when that is brought into city limits?
Yeah, does anyone have experience kind of advocating for or finding ways to see that see those higher densities come to fruition, versus maybe folks annexing, always choosing the lower density option? Or maybe that's not an issue for folks. Beth?
Damien, I was going to ask if you would talk about the Stevens Road track a little bit. But maybe that's where you were not where you were going. I don't know.
Go ahead, Dean.
I could do both. I was thinking more along the lines of your question, Steve. One of the things that's helped us is with our UGB expansion areas, including the Stevens Road tract, outlining in comprehensive plan policies the not just required amount of residential land, but also units, and then the mix for that specific expansion area. And then in our findings, tying that to how that's going to meet our goal-10 obligations for our needed housing mix. That's provided, I think, a good foundation for us to make those decisions regarding plan designation, zoning, and then in other situations where there's been an affordable housing requirement, ensuring an adequate, you know, the required number of affordable units based on AMI, and how those are phased over the development of either a master plan or an expansion area.
Thank you, Damien. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, and I apologize if someone said this before and I missed it, but I wonder if kind of the like general master plan concept might be helpful with the density issue for lands being brought in, right? Because like I imagine if a property owner, right, they're trying to get their land annexed in and they need to pick the zoning designation for it once it comes in. The reason they would choose lower densities because they don't want as many people in the immediate area around them, right? But when you have something like a master plan community, right, like think about Villable and Wilsonville, right, you have like that kind of higher density housing towards the center of the community, right, and then it gets a little bit lower as you go out and go out. I wonder if like there's kind of a way that we could, I don't know how the zoning technicalities would work on this one, but just like if you could say like, okay, like this portion, let's say I have 20 acres, right? On the 1 acre, right, where my house is, like sort of that the general acre surrounding that, right? And then for, kind of another acre around that, it's a little bit lower density, and then it gets higher and higher as you move further and further away from their home on the property. If something like that might provide an incentive for a landowner to say like, yeah, I can, handle a higher density with this coming in, knowing that like the portion near me is going to be lower. I'm not saying that's a fantastic argument from a moral ethical standpoint. I'm just saying from a legal standpoint, I wonder if that would help.
Thanks, Brock. And yeah, I'm certainly familiar with concept plans and master plans. I'm not totally sure on how many how prevalent they are across communities, doing that kind of planning for potential expansion areas.
And maybe that means you have to have an agreement with the developer.
Yeah. Al, go ahead.
Damien's comments about the bend system of dealing with this kind of get at this. What they do is they give a level of specificity at the time of the UGB expansion, at the time of the BLI update, that does a couple of things. It makes it it gives the city a very strong case for meeting the standard in the statute that when when the plan controls the zoning after an annexation, then it doesn't go to the electorate. That is in the Cape versus Beaverton case, which is cited in the memo. So the more specificity you have at the planning at the outset, the less likelihood you're going to have opposition in the first place. That's going to come at the time of the UGB expansion or the update itself and be taken care of there. And so you won't get it later when you get around the annexation. It has a second effect, which is it meets the requirements of the needed housing statutes for having concurrent zoning for efficiency measures. It's the same idea. And it allows you to say, yeah, we actually think that this area that we are annexing has a reasonable probability of developing during the 20 years with the types and locations and forms of housing that we say it will. And that's required by statute. And so the kind of specificity that I think the 2016 Bend Comprehensive Plan update had, really is kind of a model that you could work off. It's not necessarily something that has to be said this has to be done this way by rule. The courts will kind of decide that. But if you want to have a best practices guidance of some kind, point people toward situations like that, and or the Madras Exchange situation. I think those kinds of examples of things that we've seen that we like is going to help people down the road.
Sal, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I would just, with respect to annexation and a developer coming in and wanting lower densities, I would share this. I think when we're working with developers in our area and who are looking to do an annex in, and they're kind of thinking through exactly what kind of density they want to pursue and what makes sense, a significant consideration is impact to public facilities. You're looking at transportation, TPR compliance, significant effect on a transportation facility. Mm-hmm. There are cases where we've had cases where a developer would have liked to come in with higher densities, but that would trigger such a level of investment in improvements to state highway system, in this case, a new signalized intersection on 101, that was cost prohibitive, and they weren't going to pursue that higher density project for that reason. So just something to keep in mind.
Another factor. Thanks, Derek. That's helpful. Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I kind of had a question. I've never worked for a city. I work for the county, and in my naive county mind, I guess I didn't realize that a property owner could choose their zoning. I thought that the city's comp plan already sort of determined what the zoning was going to be. Is that not the case? Is the first part of my question. And I guess the second part would be maybe, maybe we do need to think about more specific requirements like what they're doing in the city of Bend.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for cities, but I think lots of times your comprehensive plan, will have, 3 zones assigned to it, right? So your low density has,
Right.
R12, R10, R8, and your medium density has R7, R5, something like that. And then the property owner can choose what zone they want to
Okay.
come in at under that comp plan designation.
Okay, that's fair. I didn't realize that was happening. I guess I also thought the zoning was already sort of predetermined and
No.
included in there. Okay, thanks.
Yep. Mary Kyle.
Well, I had the same reaction Martha did in reading that memo. So, but maybe I just missed the explanation. Is it part of because we have this weird annexation thing that requires owner consent to be annexed in the first place, one way or another, owner consent? So you have to provide them with a zoning that they'll say okay to? Because I'm still not sure why you just don't put this, why cities just don't zone it. Is it connected to that? But so I'm still a little confused on that, because if we can't get the zoning we want from lands that we're bringing into an urban growth boundary and eventually annexing, then it's not solving the city's housing needs analysis. We can't guarantee that it will. And so why are we even looking at UGB expansions if they're so tenuous as to whether or not they can provide the needed housing that we're using to justify the UGB expansion? But anyway, I was going to suggest a few more examples along the lines of what Derek offered, and I'm going to offer Ted Reed and Metro. So sorry, Ted. But in 2018, Metro expanded the urban growth boundary adjacent to 4 different cities, and at least 3 of them I think are going ahead: Wilsonville, Hillsborough, and a third one that I'm missing out on, right? Oh, Beaverton. So it might be useful to know they had to put in concept plans to Metro in order to get approved for the UGB expansion, and now they're going through the actual annexation and zoning and all that. So it might be interesting to compare what they said in their concept plan with how it's actually proving out in the zoning and planning. I think it's pretty close, maybe even exceeding densities in some places, but I don't, Ted might not have answers now, but just to provide examples down the line.
Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, we could certainly look into that more. I think generally that those expansions were made before House Bill 2001 was put into place, but we could see House Bill 2001 middle housing requirements on the horizon. And I think most of the cities have exceeded what their concept plans were contemplated as a consequence because of their need to comply with House Bill 2001.
Well, and again, since those are getting annexed into cities, that would tend to support the idea that there maybe isn't as much owner control over the eventual zoning. But anyway.
Yeah, relative to House Bill 2000, or the more recent House bills, House Bill 2001. That's interesting for Metro anyway. Go ahead, Beth.
One approach I've seen in a few different cities like McMinnville and Madras is a requirement that new subdivisions of a certain size include 2 or more different housing types. And McMinnville in particular, I think they may require 3 housing types. But they give some idea of, to make sure that it's not all single family and 1 duplex or something like that. So that can be an approach. It's more of an HPS sort of approach.
Is that a part of the zoning code, the development code?
I believe it is.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Beth.
Nope, that's all I had to say.
Okay, Kevin, go ahead.
All right, thanks. I think I wanted to respond to questions or concerns firstly, in terms of the Metro process, I will agree the 2018 process was incredible. But Metro is special. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ted, but I think Metro actually funded some of that concept planning that supported the UGB decision. Is that right?
We are special, Kevin. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, we do have a grant program that's funded through construction excise taxes that often pays for city concept planning. In some cases, cities opt to fund it on their own, but I think we paid for most of the concept plans that were submitted.
Which makes sense in the metro region. I think the point I wanted to make is that for most cities to do concept planning in advance of a UGB decision is highly speculative and probably not a good use of public resources, because at the end of the day, you don't know whether that's going to be the area that you arrive at. That said, I want to provide assurance that no, it's not. I'm not seeing a situation where developers are coming in and choosing their zoning, but there are a variety of ways that cities do their planning for their UGB areas. Some cities will do comp plan designations for the entire UGB. Some will establish holding zones. And then with each annexation, they'll look at their land needs, they'll work with the applicant and figure out what that zoning needs to be. In other cases, the cities will do the master planning for the UGB area, in advance. So there's a variety of ways to get there, but in all cases, when cities are doing that planning work, they need to be looking at their identified employment, residential, public land needs to inform those comp plan designations and zoning decisions.
Thanks, Kevin. And going back to kind of building off of what you said and going back to what Mary Kyle said, I think where there's a problem is if, if there's a disconnect between what a property owner or developer wants to build and what a concept plan may have laid out, right? So it's just the importance of having property owners and developers involved in those conversations. Go ahead, Brock.
I
Go
wasn't
ahead.
even meaning a full concept plan. I wasn't trying to suggest that, but I mean a city's vision for why they need this land, multifamily housing and commercial or something. I don't mean anything on the order of necessarily a concept plan, but the degree to which that vision, that need for the land can actually be met if you have to go through the annexation process and some owner consent stuff.
Brock, go ahead.
I don't know if there's anything that speaks to this in rule or in statute, but just kind of thinking off the cuff, I wonder if it would maybe be helpful to, if there is some kind of regulatory barrier, to provide like an exemption to, kind of a notwithstanding this, right? If a landowner, like let's say they have a home on a 20-acre property, right? And they say, okay, I want to divide my lot, right? And so I can take out the portion that I want to keep for my home, right? Everything else, I basically cede to the developer, whoever's going to buy it, right? I don't know if there's any process issues that would prevent that from happening, whether it's with like the size of the lot, given that it currently has, like a rural zoning, even though it's going to be annexed in. But if there's something maybe with like an annexation agreement where it's like, if you say that like, yes, we're going to divide the lot here, right? And then now through this annexation agreement, you're allowed to do that lot division, right? And then the rest of it, it's no longer the single owner's property, right? And so that can go to the developer, to someone else that will be able to decide, that maybe a more intensive zoning there is. Yeah.
Thanks, Brock. All right, let's go to Al, and then we're about at time to wrap up.
Just a quick note, which I think is a clarification. Maybe Damien can help me with this, but I think that we are still thinking about I think we're kind of conflating two concepts. One is master planning, and the other is performance standards. And what Ben has done is closer to what I think most of us think of as performance standards applied to an area of several properties than it is to a master plan. It guides creation of the master plan later on in a way that is more fine-grained than just the old-fashioned 1980s style Oregon Comprehensive Plan designations. But it's not the same thing as the master plan. But it is fine-grained enough to make it legitimate for a jurisdiction to say, yeah, we think this property over, or this area overall is going to be a decent fit with what our housing needs analysis and BLI and our other analyses show, including infrastructure availability, that kind of thing. So I just want us to be sure that we're not throwing out the performance standards with the master plans.
Appreciate that. Damon, would you concur with Al's summary of the Bend approach?
I would. Thanks, Al. You know, if people are curious, if you look at our comprehensive plan online in chapter 11, you'll see this series of expansion areas, and with each expansion area are a set of policies for things that either a master plan or an area plan must achieve, and then those become part of the approval criteria for the review of the master plan or area plan, depending on whether it's being initiated by the city or being initiated by a landowner.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I just we had some really good conversation around these two topics today. I feel like there was a lot of consensus around the outgoing UGB land, so that's really helpful. Lots to think about around annexation agreements, some good examples. I encourage people, if they didn't get a chance to read the memo that was included in the packet, to do so at some point. And we took notes. Certainly, Mary Kyle had some suggestions for other additional information that we could add to this memo to make it a little more useful. I just want to take a minute to reflect on the 16 meetings that we've had. We've talked about buildable lands inventories and constraints, efficiency measures, public facilities planning and financing, development ready lands, UGB amendments, UGB exchanges, UGMAs and annexation agreements. Just a really impressive list of important topics that you all have helped us think through and have set the stage for the draft rules that we're going to bring back for you all to consider when we come back in April. Jenna, Kevin, Beth, anything to add other than just our extreme appreciation to everyone for their participation?
I mean, yeah, you pretty much summed it up, Steve. When we are breaking for legislative session January through March of next year, so this is our last meeting of 2024. And during that time of January through March is really when our internal team here will be starting to draft some rule concepts based on everything we've talked about so far. We'll be looking at the Miro boards, past meeting notes. And when we come back in April, we'll actually have something to show you all and for you all to react to. So we're looking forward to that. Our next meeting will be April 3rd. And calendar invites and a follow-up email are coming. So look out for that. But I also just want to take a moment to extend my gratitude to you all. I know this is a lot of time and dedication to come to all these meetings and share your expertise, but it's really, really helpful. And I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank Steve for his excellent facilitation, and Beth and Kevin as well for their wealth of knowledge that they bring to the meetings as well. So I hope you all have a wonderful, safe holiday season and great start to the new year. And we'll see you all in 2025.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.